We are very lucky to have our very own Linda W. and S. Herbert Rhea Director, Kevin Sharp. He loves a good short introduction, so I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to him so he can tell us all about Degas and his unlikely circle of friends.
Well, thank you, Lindley. That was a very efficient introduction. I think we should probably remind everyone to put your Zoom on mute, if you would, and like I said, I'll be happy to answer as many questions about Degas or about anything for that matter at the end of this little presentation. I should also point out a couple of things. We've got Munch and Learn, operational through a viral technology, but we're doing lots and lots of education programs, digitally and virtually, and lots of our events that you may be missing. We had a wonderful culture and cocktails last night that Julie Perotti and Chantel Drake put on, and it was just kind of great. It was just kind of great. Like I said, it's not the same as being with you in person. It's not the same as feeling that energy in the room. But it's a close second, and we're really glad that that technology is such that we can bring these programs and events your way. So this the talk I'm doing today is based on an essay that I've written for our upcoming collection catalog of the Dixon's collection. The book will publish in sometime in 2021. And I've done a fair amount of work on 19th century French subjects, and Degas has factored into some of them. I've done I was involved in the major retrospective of the work of Mary Cassatt in 1998. Of course, Degas is part of it, is one of her closest associates and most important colleagues. And before that, I did work on James Abbott McNeill Whistler, and Degas and Whistler had this really kind of interesting sparring, but ultimately respectful relationship. And so, Degas has popped up in my own work a number of times, but I've never really written anything on Degas, in part because all of the curators, all the art historians that I really admire the most, my former boss, Douglas Druitt, who's an important mentor of mine, worked on Degas. Henri Lorette, the director of the Musée d'Orsay, and later the director of the Louvre, was a Degas scholar. Gary Tinderow, who was a longtime curator at the Met and is now the director of the Museum of Fine Arts Houston, was a Degas scholar, and lots of others. I mean, the scholarship on Degas is some of the best ever produced, and museum scholarship has been especially strong. And so I actually was kind of shied away from Degas a little bit because it was a tad intimidating. And when I had this opportunity in our collection catalog to address the two works by Degas that we actually own, neither of which you're going to see in this presentation, I now realize, but it called for some kind of discussion of this artist. And I thought I would just write a simple little piece about Degas and the circle of artists that I knew banded around him in the late 1870s, early 1880s, and including Mary Cassatt, including Jean-Louis Forain, including Federico Zandomenici and Francois Raffaelli, artists that are mostly in our collection that we know pretty well. Well, the more I started digging into it, this little 3,000-word essay that I was planning to produce turned into and in part it's because I'm writing up to these great scholars and curators that I admire. My greatest fear is that one of them will actually find this essay and read it and, tell me I'm an idiot or something, But I put a lot of time, thought, and effort into it. And so those 3,000 words turned into 9,000 words. And including, I would guess, another 5,000 words of footnotes, where I cite all these giants that I really admire. And so that's the origin of this talk today. And so you see Degas and his parents' unlikely circle. Now, it may seem odd. It may seem odd to think of Degas as someone who's unlikely to attract followers, but just a little bit about Degas first. He's from this old family. This family of bankers, and they have their origins in Naples, Florida. I mean, Degas born in Paris in 1834. Keep that year in your head, 1834, because it's kind of important. And like I said, he's from this family of bankers, and he has lots of family still down in Naples, and there's they're a banking family too, and it's, and the family actually has sort of pretensions of aristocracy, that they are something special, and a big chunk of the family actually takes that name Degas that you see right here. Are you actually a cursor when I'm doing that? And they take the D and the E and they turn it into an article, put a space right there and capitalize the G. And that denotes, that now you're suddenly Edgar of Degas, and that, so that is a thing that rather filters through the way Edgar Degas sees the world and the way he reacts to it. So anyway, we'll go to the first slide. So here's a portrait of Edgar Degas from 1855. He's 21 years old. He is, obviously, it's a self-portrait. He's really kind of based this image of himself on another self-portrait from about 30 years earlier by an artist named Ingres. And so he's looking at his own heroes and the artists that he admires. But for Degas, as I said, the idea that he would one day attract followers was absolutely not in his family's thinking at all. His family thought of Degas from the time he's painted this painting, and for another 15 years, they're going to see their son, their brother, their nephew as a hopeless procrastinator and a student for life. And it's someone they're not sure is going to amount to anything. And then the people that know Degas 40 years from now, say in 1895, the people that met him then, they come to think of him as a recluse, as a misanthrope, and as someone very unlikely to indulge followers, let alone inspire them. But for this one little moment in the late 70s and early 80s, it is very much, Degas sees that it's very much to his advantage to have a group of followers in his circle that will help foster his ideas about art, help him achieve success on his own terms, and more than anything, advance his ideas about what great art should be. Now, Degas, during the 1860s, and you remember what I mentioned, he was a bit of a procrastinator. This is a portrait, kind of a portrait. It's like half portrait, half genre subject. And it's of his favorite aunt Laura, and his uncle Gennaro Pilelli, and his two young cousins. And if you look at the date, it took him 11 years to paint. And that's just because he was never quite satisfied with anything. He's always working and reworking and going back and coming to things he set aside years ago. But he's clearly a brilliant portraitist. I mean, he can draw like crazy. But what he really sees himself as is a history painter. He's going to be a history painter. And throughout the 1860s, that's really what we see. And so when you think about Degas in the decade of the 1860s, it's bracketed by his 25th and 35th birthdays. He is really, in that moment, from 1860 to 1870, he is more or less unknown. Nobody really cares who Edgar Degas is. He doesn't make his public debut until 1865 with this painting, Scenes of War in the Middle Ages, which he finally submits to the annual salon, and it's accepted. And again, he's trying to advance his career as a history painter. But it's just even his history paintings have this kind of stagey look, like you're not watching a scene of war in the Middle Ages. It's like you're watching a scene from a play about a war in the Middle Ages. And you know, the thing that I find very interesting are these nude figures over here, which will come to look very much like Degas' bathers. I mean, the germ of everything he wants to be is already in him, but he is having a terrible, terrible time finding what that thing might be. So, but through the 1860s, you know, he continues to be an interesting, fascinating, really, portrait painter who takes portraiture and kind of turns it on its ear and turns his portraits into genre painting. This is a portrait of Victoria Dubourg from 1866. She's a wonderful, wonderful still life painter. But if you were going to have your painting, if you're going to have your portrait made by Degas, you know, and what a great thing to have done, by the way, if you could go back in time and have your portrait painted by anyone, would you be sitting like that, leaning forward in your chair with your hands, you know, basically in your lap? I mean, it was this kind of, but that was the kind of realism, the kind of naturalism that filtered through his work, and especially filtered through his portraiture. But he also begins to develop these kind of subjects in the late 60s and 1870s. They're not shown until much later, so he doesn't have a tremendous amount of confidence. But look what we're seeing in the background. You know, the first of the ballet dancers to appear. There'll be more than, by the time he makes the last work of art of his career, there'll be more than 1,500 ballet subjects in his body of work. He's got a kind of need to observe again and again and again. This is actually a portrait. It's a portrait of this man right here, whose name is Désiré Daou. He's a bassoonist, and when Degas gives him this portrait, we don't know whether it was a commission. We kind of don't think so. Our conventional wisdom is that we don't think it was a commission portrait. But he actually, all these people are known. All these people are from Degas' circle, but the one in the front, this bassoonist, Désiré Daou, was presented this portrait in 1871. And when Degas hands the thing over, you know, Degas' family is thrilled, because it seems to be the first evidence that Degas really has the capacity to finish anything. You know, he's just one of those who never can quite get things done. And then the other subject that turns up in his work in the late 60s and into the early 70s are his race course subjects. So all of this slow development of Edgar Degas, so let's say we're up to 1870. You know, he's now 36 years old, and he's submitted to the Salon every year, but nobody really notices. I mean, his works aren't really reviewed. He's not considered anyone of any particular promise. And then the Franco-Prussian War in 1870, and this is a disaster. And so without getting too much into it, Franco-Prussian War is the war between France and Prussia, and Prussia just destroys France in that war. Simply not ready. It signals the collapse of Napoleon III's Second Empire. It's followed by the Prussian siege of Paris, and Degas serves as a part of the National Guard, and it's the first time he begins to experience the eye trouble that will plague him and terrify him his entire life. And then in 1871, there's the rise of the Commune, which served as a kind of provisional government for a very short time. But then the official government, which had retreated to Versailles, comes back with what's left of the French army and violently suppresses the Commune. And this is City Hall basically in Paris in 1871, Hotel de Ville, which was eventually rebuilt. So Degas, Degas part of this National Guard. We don't know really how he feels about the Commune, but he's probably not highly supportive of it. He's not part of the suppression of it either. He's mostly worried about his eyes. And the one thing that comes out of this is that he's reunited with a childhood friend whose battalion he serves in the National Guard, a man named Henri Rouart, who we will see sometime later. So in the fall of 1871, things are slowly beginning to come back to some form of normalcy in Paris. Degas decides to go to London to see if the chances of selling work are better there than they are in Paris, which is obviously still rebuilding. And it's in London that he meets this man, Paul Durand-Ruel, probably the most important figure who was not an artist in the Impressionist circle. Durand-Ruel owned a gallery in Paris, and he's the first artist to really embrace the Impressionists. He's slow to do it, but he does finally become supportive of the Impressionist generation, starting with Manet, but eventually being the primary dealer for Degas, Monet, Renoir, Pissarro, Mary Cassatt, and many, many others. So he's an incredibly important figure in all of this. And in January 1872, Durand-Ruel buys 2 works of art of Edgar Degas. Now, this, if the painting for the bassoonist was the first tangible evidence that Degas could finish anything, the sale to Durand-Ruel in January of 1872 was the first tangible evidence that Degas could maybe possibly make a living by selling his art. And at this point, how old is Degas? He's 37 years old, going to be 38 later in the year. And these are the first works he actually sells. So he's got a little tailwind, Degas does. He's got some air in his sails. He's got something going. So what does he do? What does Degas do? He's just met this dealer. This dealer's just bought work. What would you do next? Well, you leave the country for several months. He gets on a ship. It comes to the United States and visits his family in New Orleans. Not a good idea. Not a good idea. I mean, it was just, it stalled every bit of momentum he had generated, meager though it was. Now, he does produce an undisputable masterpiece in this Cotton Office in New Orleans. It's a brilliant work of art. It depicts, his family. His uncle Michel Mousson is right here. This is his brother Rene, who's kind of a shiftless loser. And this is I think this may be Achille. You'll notice that they're the only ones who aren't doing anything. And Rene has actually married into his own family. He has married the daughter of Michel Mousson, who is actually his cousin, possibly even a first cousin. Not that he'll eventually abandon that family, and that will. Anyway, it's not good, and obviously the New Orleans branch of the family was pretty annoyed at the Degas for a pretty long time. But Degas stays there for several months, but he recognizes that it may have been a bad decision right away. He writes a letter to his friend Henri Rouart. Remember Henri Rouart, who he served under in the National Guard. And he writes that, that I don't know what I'm doing here. A few family portraits is all it's going to amount to. This is probably a mistake. and then he adds Manet, meaning Edward Manet. Manet would see lovely things. Now, Manet. Manet, Manet is probably the only artist that Degas will truly feel a kind of powerful competitive edge. You'll see this is Degas' own portrait of Edward Manet and his wife, Suzanne, and you'll notice that someone's been painted over. Well, Manet did that. He hated the way Degas represented his wife, and so he paints this panel over and gives it back to Degas. Degas is furious. Degas is livid, and that's just one of many ways in which they will encounter one another. But the thing to remember is that while we're talking, it's now 1873, Degas is still mostly unknown. Manet, on the other hand, is almost exact contemporary. Manet's only 1 year older, and Manet's painted this, and is so well known in Paris. I mean, he's notorious, but he is absolutely known. He's also more recently painted this. And so these paintings were such success to scandal that Manet's famous. And so and the thing that's going to happen is that anytime anything with the Impressionists is noted in the Parisian press, it's always prefaced with members of the school started by Manet. And don't think that doesn't make them all crazy too. So on December 27th, 1873, we know the exact date. We don't know where the meeting occurred, but we know when it occurred. On that day in 1873, a group of artists, namely Edgar Degas, Monet, Claude Monet, Pierre Auguste Renoir, Camille Pissarro, Bertha Morisot, and a number of others. There are probably 30 members in all, found a thing called the Société Anonyme des Artistes, the Anonymous Society of Artists. And this is what we've come to call the Impression. The Society, the Anonymous Society, Society, Société Anonyme. And they actually have a charter. I mean, they're organized. They're going to do things differently. And their plan is to organize exhibitions, non-juried exhibitions, that they will host at the time of the salon, to show their force, of which they had none. They plan to foster sales of their work, through these exhibition venues, and they ultimately hope to publish a journal, a magazine, a publication at any rate. These are the three primary goals that are in the charter of the Société Anonyme. And by April 15th, they have won the first Impressionist exhibition up on the wall on the Boulevard de Capucine in the former studio of the photographer Nadar. And Degas shows these brilliant ballet subjects. Now, they didn't tend to be dancers on the stage as much as dancers in rehearsal, dancers in bar, dancers in stretching. I mean, he does somehow Degas gets to a point where, he sees the value of painting a dancer yawning with her hands behind her head. It's extraordinary. They're practicing. There's, these two double bases, or these double bases right here in the foreground, are actually, obstructing our view. And that was just, it was so modern and so remarkable and so good. And this is where Degas is going to plant his flag. And so we will see dance subjects from Degas, right from the beginning, even, long before he's made those 1,500 works I talked about earlier, he is identified with this particular subject. Now, he can't sell them. Nobody wants them. The press identifies Degas with these works. And so the 1874 show happens. It lasts a month. It's on the Boulevard de Capucine. And the writers come to see it, and they're probably, I don't know, there's probably 40 or 50 reviews of the exhibition. It wasn't like, you know, like they put on a show and nobody came. They did come. And the writers universally, almost universally, hated it. Just ridiculed the show. You know, and I've said this many times, in many respects, that was the best thing the Impressionist generation could hope for. The worst thing would have been had they just been completely ignored. But suddenly there's all this discussion in the air. And for years, the artists who are part of the Impressionist circle will say, yes, it's made me famous, but no, it's made me no money at all. Okay? So the show closes a month after it opened, and everybody hated it, and they sold no paintings, and the society, the anonymous society, the Société Anonyme, disbands on May 15th, the very day the exhibition closed. It's all over. We're done. But fortunately, we're not. So there were all these other, just a litany of failures in 1875. Too many for me to get into. But it's sometime in late 1875. There was no show that year, of course, because the Société Anonyme doesn't exist. But then in late 1875, they get together again and say, hey, let's give it another try. And so there's another show in 1876. And basically, and this I'm just showing you, this is the Degas' portrait of his friend Henri Rouart, who was a brilliant artist in his own right, but he was also an engineer and an inventor and an incredibly prosperous individual who kind of keeps the Impressionist generation afloat by buying their work when no one else will. He's a good friend to Degas, and they'll remain friends for the rest of Henri Rouart's life. This is him in front of his refrigeration factory. He was vetting refrigeration in the 1860s and 70s, so it obviously made him a very, very rich man. And his collection, I would say, every work that he collected during his lifetime wound up in a major museum. Henri Rouart. And in 1876, Degas focused on portraiture. Even though he developed a little notoriety with his ballet subjects, or at least he got a little attention for him, he doesn't show very many. And what he shows is his portraits. And so again, you're going to have your portrait made. Do you actually turn your back on Degas when he's painting you, as Madame Gentot has done here, probably at Degas' instruction? He is absolutely perverse in the way he wants to approach things. But he shows portraits in 1876, and I think that may have possibly been in the hope of trying to make a little money out of this career of his. The show in 1876, the results are no better than they were in 1870. There were almost no sales. It was, the show was blasted by the critics, just as it had been in 1874. About all it demonstrated was a certain staying power by this group of artists, and that was kind of important. Now, the only really tangible thing to come out of the 1876 Impressionist exhibition was the recruitment of another artist to the group. And that artist was Gustav Kaivon, who we see here in a later self-portrait. Kaivon, like Henri Rouart, was an incredibly talented painter, and from a very prosperous family who manufactured textiles in the 1860s, 70s. He's very rich, and he's a good 15 years younger than Degas, but he's talented, and he's interested, and he's like a new convert. He believes in the Impressionist experiment, and he backs up that belief by buying work. And so here he is in his self-portrait, sitting in front of Renoir's Bal of the Moulin de la Galette, one of the absolute masterpieces, which Kaivon the Impressionist years, which Caillebotte purchased. Now, Caillebotte showed these incredible paintings. One of my favorite paintings of the 19th century is his Four Squares, 1975. That was in the 1876 exhibition, as was the Pont de l'Europe, which, again, just a brilliant, brilliant painting. And that kind of describes modern Paris. There's a workman over here, a dog, anyone, this flaneur, this man of the city, who's walking in, the basic uniform of a flaneur with his top hat and his coat, and he's glancing back at this woman that he doesn't know, but sometimes a glance is all it takes. And so anyway, Caillebotte's brilliant, and he's captured this incredible quality, the slice of modern life in Paris. And as we know, that's a very important thing. What Caillebotte, about the only person to really come out of the 1876 show better off than when he started was Gustav Kaivon. Caillebotte was unknown until then. He's young. He's not even 30. He's 28 years old. And so critics see the work. They like the work, kind of. They don't know why he's painting, why he's not taking his work to the salon, but Caillebotte actually makes a little bit of, gains a little bit of traction in this exhibition, and he's determined there'll be a show in 1877. So in December of 76, he hosts a dinner party. He sends invitations to Manet, to Monet, to Renoir, to Pissarro, and to Degas to talk about what that show is going to be in 1877. Now, Manet has never agreed to show it, and he never will. For better or for worse, his fortunes are going to reside at the salon. Even though he's identified with this group, even though he's identified again and again as the leader of the group, he does not take part. Caillebotte wants there to be an exhibition in 1877 very badly because he's about finished with this work. Undoubtedly the largest and most important canvas of his career, Rainy Day in Paris, which is now in the collection of the Art Institute. It's about 10 feet wide. It's unquestionably his masterpiece. So he's determined there will be a show. And Caillebotte does everything to make sure there is one. He writes little notes to all the artists, encouraging them to take part and to get along with one another and not to bicker, and we can get this thing done, and we just got to stick together. He's very encouraging. And he's rich enough that he buys works by Degas, by Pissarro, by Renoir, and by Monet in this moment, and that makes a tremendous amount of difference in how cooperative they are. And many scholars believe that the 1877 Impressionist Exhibition was the greatest of the 8 shows. And you see it right here in, Monet shows his Gare Saint-Lazare paintings, the series of paintings in the Saint-Lazare train station in Paris. They're all smoke and people crowded together and trains, iron. It's just this train shed overhead, and it's just one of the most brilliant bodies of work of the Impressionist generation. And Pissarro shows the gardens of Les Batterins near Pontoise. That's probably one of his largest and most ambitious paintings of the 1870s as well. It's not particularly typical of Pissarro in the 1870s, but it's a masterpiece. And of course, Renoir shows the exquisite Bal du Moulin de la Galère. It's which Caillebotte will buy out of 1877 and put in the background of his own self-portrait. And so Caillebotte's thrilled. I mean, this time Caillebotte's getting all the props, he's getting all the attention, and he's young, he's successful, and he's just absolutely loving it. And at this same moment, Degas is at rock. Okay, it's 1877. Degas' father, his aristocratic banker father, had died in 1874, and little by little, slowly but surely, it's discovered that the Degas Bank in Paris is propped up entirely on credit, that there's no money at all, and that's really, really bad. So this aristocratic air that Degas has, there's no need to worry about money, suddenly comes to it crashing in. Moreover, a court ruling determines that he and his brother-in-law are responsible for tens of thousands of dollars worth of debt, tens of thousands of francs worth. And so at this point in 1877, Degas is at rock bottom. Caillebotte is, on a really positive trajectory, and Caillebotte is, even more determined in that there would be a show in 1878 that he was in 1877. Caillebotte has anxiety about his own mortality. The Caillebottes tended to drop dead young, so Caillebotte does his will in 1877, and in it, he actually makes a provision for another Impressionist exhibition in 1878. And it would make all the sense in the world for there to be an Impressionist show in 1878, because it's the same year as the Paris World's Fair. The same World's Fair that's going to draw more than 16 million people to Paris. And so, everyone is talking about this fair. Plus, it's the first World's Fair in Paris after the Franco-Prussian War. So it's Paris's chance to show that it has finally rebuilt. And so, yes, there will be an Impressionist exhibition in the summer of 1878, starting in June of 1878, to take advantage of all this excitement about the city of Paris. Of course, this will work. And at first, Degas kind of helpful, and Caillebotte's trying to run things, and Pissarro is, as always, being enormously helpful. But then and things seem to be, in line. And then in May, Pissarro goes to visit Degas, and Degas says, "I don't really have anything ready." And Caillebotte is furious, but there's nothing you can do. Degas had that much kind of, not necessarily power, but he had that much influence, and they couldn't really imagine doing a show without him in it. And any little thing could kind of derail this collective endeavor they were in anyway. And Degas' withdrawal, he said, we can do something in the fall. Maybe, but nothing happens. Degas just and I don't know whether he does this intentionally. I kind of think he might have, or whether it's just, again, even though at this point in 1878, he's 44 years old. I don't know whether he does this intentionally or whether he has just frittered the time away, as he had a tendency to do. If it's just more of Degas' procrastination, but it doesn't. A show doesn't happen. And when the 1879 rolls around and it's time for there to be an exhibition again, Degas takes control. So I really think he derailed the 78 show, more than he just frittered the time. Because by 1879, he's absolutely making this incredible portrait of Diego Martelli, a Florentine writer who is the first to announce that there will be an 1879. He writes an article in a Roman newspaper announcing that the show will open sometime in March. And then Degas is also at work for the 1879 exhibition on a portrait of his good friend Edmond Duranty, who is the voice of aesthetic realism, the realism that came from painters like Courbet and even Manet to some degree, but also the novels of Émile Zola, and so he was a novelist himself. He has reinvented himself as an art critic, and he supports he supports realism in art more than impressionism in art. And he is Degas' very good friend. He's one of Degas. He is one of Degas' closest friends. Now, Degas has this absolute aristocrat's antipathy to art critics and writers. He just doesn't like it. He doesn't like having to chase after reviews to earn his success. I mean, you know, it's like an aristocrat's finding publicity events, and that's the pose Degas has always struck. But suddenly in 1879, he is seeing the value. He is seeing the value of bringing a circle of writers around him to prop up the exhibition he's now thinking of as his own. Plus, it was Durante in 1876 who writes this pamphlet called The New Painting, La Nouvelle Peinture. And in it, he doesn't identify any of, and it's essentially a review of the 1876 show, not in a newspaper, but in a pamphlet format. It's a long form review. And he does this really weird thing where he discusses some of the work, but he also discusses the historical precedents for the work. It's not really criticism, you know, it's kind of a long form essay, but he does this really weird thing where he doesn't identify any of the artists by name. You know, he's in some way, you know, he describes them in very specific terms, but he doesn't identify them by name. But he does later on in a copy of the new painting that he gives to Diego Martelli, write their names in the margins. So and that copy survives, and so we know who he's talking about. And so, you know, he talks about some artists in the Impressionist circle quite a lot, and some very little. I mean, he doesn't even mention Renoir. He barely mentions Monet. He acknowledges Manet, who's not even in the show, and he doesn't talk about Pissarro or Sisley at all. And when he talks about Degas, he doesn't talk about the work, but he does say this. He does say this, and I'm quoting here. Many artists will not admit that his talent, that they have profited from his, don't know who, from his conceptions and artistic generosity. If he still cares to employ his talents unsparingly as a philanthropist of art, instead of as a businessman like so many other artists, he ought to receive justice. The source from which so many painters have drawn their inspiration ought to be revealed. Ought to be revealed, but he's not going to reveal it. But he ought to be revealed. Now, we know he's talking about Degas because he wrote it in the margin, but we know he did it in. We have to think that Degas actually wrote it. We think that Degas may have dictated the new painting to Durante or something to that effect. It was a strategy that was designed to do two things. You know, it's to claim that, you know, maybe other artists have been pilfering from him over the years, but it was also, if he's this great philanthropist, it's also designed to attract us. Okay. So anyway, there's not really any evidence that Degas was such a philanthropist in art up until this point at all. You know, he's not been particularly helpful to anyone, and it doesn't really seem like any of his significant relationships with other artists were really, you know, that he was pilfered from or that he influenced them. They all seem kind of transactional in their way. But if there were two artists that Degas believed had stolen from him or mined his creativity for their own success, they are undoubtedly, one is undoubtedly Edward Manet. You know, Degas hated this about Manet. Manet's this vanguard artist, I'm off the charts, I am shocking, and everybody hates me, but look at me, I'm so put together. You know, I'm stylish. He had this kind of very polished image of himself. It was intentionally meant to exist as a contradiction, and a very studied contradiction. Fontaine-Latour's portrait of Edward Manet is one of my favorite portraits of the 19th century. It's just so good, and such a portrait in the same way that none of Degas' portraits are portraits. You know, this is a portrait, mind you. This is a portrait. I A man standing there in his coat, top hat, looking straight out at us, holding his walking stick, got one glove off and one glove on. That's undifferentiated background. We're not seeing a factory in the background. We're not seeing, he's not turning around and looking in a mirror. He's not slumped in a chair with his hands in his lap. He's Manet, and that's what he presents, and that made Degas crazy. Plus, Manet had always enjoyed the support of the most important writers of his age, starting with Charles Baudelaire. And this is Manet's portrait of Baudelaire, and Baudelaire is an important friend, but also as an art critic, a very valuable supporter of Manet. Baudelaire dies in 1867, but not before he had done his part to put Manet on a certain platform. And when Baudelaire dies in 67, that mantle is taken over by Émile Zola. Here's Manet's portrait of Zola sitting at his desk with a reproduction of Manet's Olympia on his little ledge here, a Japanese print over here, a piece of a Japanese screen over here, and then a painting by Velázquez behind Olympia, which kind of shows the roots of Manet's genius. And then, Manet or Zola becomes such a huge success as a novelist. He begins to kind of move away from art criticism, and that role is taken over in the 1870s by this man, Stéphane Mallarmé, who is maybe the second most brilliant poet of the French 19th century. And the first most incomprehensible. I mean, his poetry is so symbolic and complex. It's hard to figure out, what it really means. The last book of poetry Mallarmé writes is called A Throw of the Dice. Results in chance, and the poem is almost like the words are put together by chance. I mean, it's brilliantly intellectual, but it's also, I can't even pretend to understand it. But I love this little portrait as well. And so Manet has this studied image. He's propped up by these impressive literary figures. And by the way, Mallarmé was also fluent in English and was the first person to translate the work of Edgar Allan Poe, the poems of Edgar Allan Poe, into French, and starting a kind of wild popularity for Poe in Paris and the rest. Plus, Manet seemed to be messing with Degas in the mid-70s. Mallarmé writes this piece called Edward Manet and the Impressionists in 1876, right after Duranty's new painting came out. He publishes it in an English magazine. It's commissioned of them. They want it. And I mean, this is the first time that Manet has ever deigned to be considered part of the Impressionists. He won't show with them. And he seems to revel in, he's friends with all of them, but this was the first time there's a public acknowledgement that, yes, I, Edward Manet, I lead the Impressions. And it made Degas crazy. Plus, like I said, Manet just seemed to be taunting Degas in the mid-70s. This is Manet's painting in the conservatory. Notice the man leaning, the woman kind of, in her pose. There's Degas painting sulking from 6-7 years earlier. I think you can see the similarities immediately. Even the man looks like the same man. But this man right here in the Degas painting is actually Edmond Duranty. The writer Edmond Duranty, who he portrays again in 1879. It's not much of a portrait, it's more of a genre painting. The interesting thing is, Duranty and Manet will actually fight a duel in 1871 with swords. And Duranty is not seriously wounded, but he's hit with Manet's épée and hurt badly enough that Manet is satisfied. Duranty had written something unfavorable in a review. So anyway, the fact that, hang on, The fact that Manet seems to find this guy that looks a little bit like Durante and puts him in a pose that Durante had struck sort of, and paired him with, and it's just like, what are you doing? And then, he starts to work and he starts to produce these bather subjects, Manet does. This is a pastel on canvas of a bather, and Degas had been painting bathers for about 3 years at that point. And so it's just like, he is going after me. This will create a kind of friction between the two artists that will last for years. And Manet becomes just completely enamored with the pastel medium. And, that's another thing that Degas believed belonged to him. So when Durante says that maybe, just maybe, somebody, is stealing from Degas, he's maybe a little bit right. And so the second artist that was kind of getting under Degas' skin in this moment is Pierre Auguste Renoir. And this is Frederic Bazille's wonderful portrait of Renoir from 1867. Now, Degas didn't mind Renoir when he painted like this. This is Renoir painting at La Grenouillère. He's painting side by side with his friend Claude Monet right here, and he's painting the frog pond, basically, and which is what La Grenouillère means. And it was a popular watering hole, and people came here to kind of get together and drink and dance and all that kind of stuff. Popular boating spot. But suddenly in 1874, Renoir is making these scenes at the theater, of all things. The Loge. Now, this is the brilliant painting that's now in the Courtauld Institute in London. And it's very much identified with Renoir, but at the time, Renoir hadn't really taken on subjects like this. And then the other painting he shows in 1874 is this one. Remind you of anybody? Yeah. So, Degas, when he's either helping Durante write the new painting or he's actually writing it himself, he is taking shots at his two greatest rivals, Manet and Renoir. Catch up with myself here a little. So in 1876, remember Degas shows portraits at the second Impressionist show, and guess who else shows portraits in the 1876? Renoir. Didn't bother to put any in, but that's just a little background. So in 1878, at the moment that Degas is ruining their plans to have an Impressionist exhibition at the same time as the Paris World's Fair, this man, Théodore Duret, writes yet another pamphlet, and it's called The Impressionist Painters, Contre-Impressionistes. And Duret this was a portrait that Manet made of him 10 years earlier. Duret is a consummate insider. He is, he knows all of the Impressionists very well. He's a collector. He's got money. His family was in the cognac business, and he was fairly wealthy, and he styled himself as a writer. He was the first writer to produce a biography of Manet, and he wrote at some length about the Impressionists. But in 1878, so now we're right on the heels of the new painting pamphlet, he writes a pamphlet about the Impressionists where he does name names, and the names he named are Renoir, Monet, Pissarro, Sisley, those are the Impressionists. Notice anybody missing from that group? Yeah, Degas did too. Now Degas mentioned at the end of this pamphlet, but the true Impressionists were the artists I just named, and those are the ones that Durante writes about. And of course that creates this kind of disunity, this division between. Now there are decidedly two camps, and so when Degas begins to organize the 1879 Impressionist show, he insists on calling it an exhibition of the independents. He also adds a codicil to the Impressionist charter that says if you show at the Salon, you cannot show with the Impressionist. And artists begin to fall away left and right. The first artist to fall away is Renoir. Renoir just throws up his hands and says, "I'm not doing it. I got to show it. I got to show it the Salon." He had been working on portraiture, as I mentioned, and part of it was out of a genuine aesthetic interest, but some of it was out of, I've got to make painting a paying proposition. I've got to make a living from this thing. Plus, he had social ambition, and he had the desire to see his portraiture succeed. He needed, he needed the money, and so he bows out of the 1879 exhibition Degas organized. As does Sisley. Monet is about to, for very different reasons, but Caillebotte, the very helpful Caillebotte, goes around Paris and collects 20 paintings from various collectors so Monet can be represented in the show. But Degas brings in the artist Mary Cassatt, the artist Jean-Louis Forain. He tries to bring in Raffaelli, but Raffaelli may have been blackballed by the rest of the artists. And he brings in, of course, his friend Henri Rouart takes part, as does, I'm leaving somebody else. No, that's probably it. That's probably it. And so he suddenly has a circle. He has a circle of artists. If to emphasize the fact that they are all on the same page, all the artists that are part of Degas' circle in 1879 show artist-painted fans. Here's one of the fans that Degas showed. Here's a fan from our collection that was by Jean-Louis Forain that was in the 1879. They even kind of co-opt Pissarro into their circle, almost to demonstrate how they're not chasing anyone away. And Pissarro makes fans for the exhibition. Berthe Morisot made fans that even some reviewers even discussed, but they weren't shown. She pulls out at the last minute, probably in sympathy with Renoir. And Mary Cassatt doesn't show fans, but most of the women in loges that she paints and shows in 1879 are holding, guess what? A one-of-a-kind artist. So it's a kind of, in this moment, Degas has this kind of traction going. He has a group of followers, and these followers are benefiting from their interaction with him. And Renoir, meanwhile, is making, these commissioned portraits. This is a portrait of Madame Georges Charpentier. It's now in the collection of the Met with I can't remember the children's names, but that's their daughter. This is their son. Yeah, it's true. And their giant Newfoundland. And this painting is big and, very flattering. And it was shown in the 1879 Salon and to huge acclaim. But Degas doesn't really care. And so the 1879 Impressionist show is no more finished than Degas already thinking about what the 1880 show is going to look like. And the 1880 exhibition is going to feature etchings. They're going to produce a journal called Day and Night, Le Jour et la Nuit, which reflects the black and white quality of graphic art. And he gets everybody together. We're going to produce this journal. And Cassatt gets on board and produces this drawing that's later translated into a print of her mother and sister sitting by lamplight, sewing and reading. Forain jumps on board. He likes printmaking anyway, and so he makes prints. Pissarro's still ready to help. He makes this incredible etching. One of my this incredibly experimental etching. I mean, this etching exists in dozens of different states. And Degas, of course, produces etchings as well, including this, remarkable print of Mary Cassatt and her sister Lydia at the Louvre. This is Mary Cassatt. This is her sister Lydia. and they're in the Etruscan galleries. Now, one of the curious things that happened, you know, in that, remember that pamphlet of Théodore de Rez, where, you know, the Impressionist painter. At the end of that, at the very last pages of that pamphlet, he goes on this kind of flight of fancy where he talks about, let's take a walk through the Louvre, you know, and the whole point of it is to demonstrate that you can like old master painting and still like new work as well. I mean, it was a perfectly reasonable thing to do, and he sets it up as a kind of food thing, a little appetite thing, you know. It's like you want a balanced diet of great things from the Italian Renaissance or from the Northern Renaissance or Baroque painting or 18th century French, but you also want to have something contemporary in your diet. But it's all a little bit snarky. It's a little bit snide in the way he puts it. And as it turns out, you know, and it's just this fake walk through the Louvre, you know, that, you know, he's not really doing because it's a pamphlet. You can't do it. But the interesting thing is Durante had just started writing a series of articles in the Gazette des Beaux-Arts, the Gazette of Fine Arts, called Promenade au Louvre. So, meaning walks through the Louvre. So it was absolutely barbed at Edmond Durante that Degas would have taken very personally. And so when Degas begins to think about his own journal, Day and Night, Le Jour et la Nuit, you know, the first print he's thinking about for that journal is an image of one of his followers at the Louvre. You know, it's point, counterpoint, you know, and it's all done in a kind of brilliant way. But all it winds up doing is creating an even deeper fissure in the Impressionist. So in 1880, all of these artists show these prints, but sadly, Le Jour et la Nuit never gets done. It all falls apart. Mary Cassatt's mother writes this hilarious letter to her son in the United States, talking about what an idiot Degas is. He never finishes anything. He had this great chance and he blew it, you know, and Mary spent all this time making these etchings and she couldn't paint. And that was such a shame. Well, these prints are some of the most brilliant and experimental prints of the French 19th century. And all of the artists who are in this circle will continue to be printmaking a central part of their artistic practice for the rest of their careers. And Mary Cassatt in particular will make what I believe in the suite of color prints she'll make in the 1890s, the most important prints of the entire 19th century, the most brilliant, experimental, and successful. But of course, it wasn't seen that way. It wasn't seen that way in the moment. They're undermining the very reason you make, which is so is the multiplicity of it. So anyway, it just winds up like sort of shattering the Impressionist experiment in 1880. By 1881, Kaivon just had enough. Degas is too divisive. He puts a wedge in everything. I just can't do this anymore. And so Monet pulls out. Monet decides, well, Renoir's had some success at the Salon. Maybe I'll try as well. So Monet pulls out of the album. And Gauguin, who enters in 79 and joins again in 1880, decides in 1881 he can't deal with it either. He simply can't deal with it either. And so basically the Impressionists are in two camps, but here's what happened. And it's all clearly Degas' fault. He won't soften his stance on showing at the Salon. And he wants the Impressionist experiment to be more of a reflection of his own aesthetic priority. So, like I said, they all go their separate ways. But by 1881, and there is a show in 1881, and it's Degas and his followers, but without Kaivon to argue with, without Renoir to spar with, without the Impressionist camp to be a kind of foil to his own vision of what art should be, he just kind of loses interest, you know, and basically the Impressionist circle just goes its own way, you know. And in 1882, there is a show, but Degas doesn't take part in it. He boycotts it. Oh, let me show you this. So here's this brilliant print. Look, notice that the umbrella is in Mary Cassatt's left hand. He takes the matrix of this print, he makes a tracing of it, and turns it around and puts them in painting galleries. Degas will mess with this print, and then he put pastel over the top of it. He will play with this basic composition backward and forward probably 20 times. I mean, and they're some of the most remarkable works. And Mary Cassatt is always leaning on her umbrella, and Lydia Cassatt is always reading from the book. Just kind of brilliant. So anyway, when Degas withdraws from the 1882 show, everybody else withdraws with them, and they simply can't hold themselves together anymore. And that's more or less, 1882 is more or less the end of the circle itself. It's not the end of Degas' relationship with each of the artists in the circle. He continues, of course, to be close friends with Henri Renoir, with Mary Cassatt, Jean-Louis Ferrand, with Federico Zandomeneghi, and with Raffaelli, but they don't stay connected to each other. And so, and Degas just sort of in the 1880s becomes wildly successful. You know, his art is suddenly very much in demand, you know, whereas he couldn't give it away in the 1870s. Suddenly collectors and dealers want it like crazy. And what they want are his dancers. And so what he produces is anything but dancers. He turns to this fascination with bathers. And and it's his opportunity, it's his way of drawing the figure over and over and over and over. And there are hundreds and hundreds of these pastels of bathers. And it's almost as if, you know, he is staking his claim here now. You know, Manet was there for a while. Manet dies in 1883. You know, this was mine before Manet, and it's mine after. And so he embraces this kind of interior world. And, you know, we think of Monet as the artist who produces all the serial imagery, all the many paintings of grain stacks, but it's Degas who does it first. You know, with his ballet dancers again and again and again. Mary Cassatt in the Louvre again and again and again. And these bathing subjects again and again and again. And his circle will embrace it as well. Mary Cassatt. How many mother and child compositions are there? Hundreds. It's Cassatt learning from Degas and embracing the significance of exploring a certain theme again and again and again. She will be wildly, wildly successful, as will Jean-Louis Ferrand. He'll become, not in the same way, he will become one of the greatest illustrators of the 1890s. And Degas, when people that came to Degas' studio will see stacks and stacks of Ferrand prints in Degas' salon. His good friend, Henri Renoir, who started his career as a landscapist, becomes in the 1880s much more of a figure painter, a la his friend Edgar Degas. And Raffaelli, well, Raffaelli's an interesting story. This is our painting of Raffaelli. It's painted in 1877. And Raffaelli's not 30 years old, but he's about the age of Kaivon, in fact. And he makes this incredible painting of the Place d'Italie after the rain, and it's brilliant. He will go in a different direction later in his career. Raffaelli seemed to be the sticking for a lot of the older Impressionists, and he was definitely the sticking point for Paul Gauguin. Couldn't stand Raffaelli, and at any number of times, any number of times. The Impressionists in 1882 would have let Degas exhibit with them if he just simply picked Raffaelli out, but he wouldn't do it. And they thought just maybe it all went back. You know, and Raffaelli was born in Paris. He was French as French could be, but he had this Italian name. And they all thought it went back to Degas' affection for all things. They did it. So Degas does become sort of more private in the 1890s and in the 20th century, but he's not a recluse really. He has a lively circle of friends that he sees off, and his studio is frequently open to visitors. He's so successful he doesn't really have to sell work. He doesn't really exhibit his work after 1886. But he does produce work. He produces brilliant work throughout the 1890s, revisiting some of the themes that he'd explored earlier in his career. His eyesight wanes. He loses his eyesight. His friend Henri Rouart dies the year this photograph was made. By this time, Degas is nearly blind. And when Henri Rouart's collection is sold at auction in 1913, a Degas pastel fetches the highest price of any work by a living artist. It sells for over 200,000 francs. Henri Rouart may have bought that ballet pastel for 400. So anyway, at the end of his life, Degas finally passes away in 1917, and he's buried in the family vault at the cemetery in Montmartre. And at his funeral are Barry Cassatt, Jean-Louis Forain, Enrico Zandomenici, and Raphael. And so the circle of Edgar Degas comes full circle to say goodbye to their old friend, the artist that no doubt meant more to them than any other. So Edgar Degas, there he is in his unlikely circle. Any questions come in, Lindley?
Yes, thank you, Kevin. That was great. Okay. I have to get through questions about seeing things.
I'm so bad. I'm sorry this went so long. You're very patient to stick with me.
It was very good. Okay, so Julie wants to know, did Degas ever paint portraits of people who weren't his friends or family? Did anyone just commission him to paint their portrait?
I don't really think so. That would have felt too tradesman-like, I think, to Degas. I mean, it's not I'm trying to. Now, I don't think it happened. I mean, I can't think of it. I cannot think of an example of it. Good question, Julie.
Okay, and it was a good question. And in the early years of his career, when his family saw him as, a ne'er-do-well, and he was just kind of procrastinating and everything, was he getting respect and admiration from his contemporaries, from other artists at that point? Not really.
Most of, there are these, I think they were just completely, I mean, they knew he had talent, but I think they believed he was just going to go nowhere with it. Bertha Morisot writes this letter saying that, basically that I can't believe this guy is almost 40 years old and he's still copying in the Louvre like a teenager. I mean, she says it in a different way, but he doesn't exhibit a work publicly until he's over 30 years old. And I mean, that's not like your life is over when you're 30 or anything, but it was a very, very late bloomer. And then when he does show that painting of the scenes of war in the Middle Ages, and it just, nobody noticed it. I don't think anybody in the 1860s thought that, well, here's the next Edward Manet.
So speaking of Manet, I seem to hear a lot, not only, you know, in this talk, but in other talks too, about how people didn't seem to like Manet very much. So what contemporary artists were friends and supporters of Manet?
Well, I think people were jealous of him more than they didn't like him. He was a very likable guy. I mean, Whistler was his friend, Alfred Stevens was his friend, Fontaine Latour was his good friend. You know, Manet was at first very suspicious of Monet because he had this name that sounded like his own, and he was afraid that people were going to confuse them. But they ultimately become very good. He and Renoir. Caillebotte gets to know him. Jean-Louis Forain. I mean, we come to think of Jean-Louis Forain as very much a Degas acolyte. Before he was a Degas acolyte, he was very much, you know, modeling his career after Manet, or trying. So yeah, Manet, you know, Manet's much more likable in many respects than Degas. Degas is incredibly witty and very smart, but he can be completely unlikable at any number of times in his career. And the older he got, the less, the less likable in many ways.
So when you named those 5 quote unquote official Impressionist artists, my sound cut out a little bit, and I want to make sure I get all 5 of those. Will you name those again?
Yeah, it's Renoir, Monet, Pissarro, Sisley, and Morisot.
Okay, so that is the last question that's in the chat. If anyone has any questions, you can feel free to type them right now, or since we're in the end, we can unmute and you can ask a question.
Yeah, if you like. And you know, I don't know if she's still on. I don't know if she's still on this Zoom. You know, but I saw one of my oldest friends, somebody I've known since the 3rd grade, Judy Richardson, joined in. I'm surprised she didn't have some embarrassing question for me from like, you know, the 6th grade or something.
Maybe she'll private message you that.
Yeah, she's probably too polite. I'd have one if she was doing the Zoom, I can tell you that, and she knows it. It's also one of my favorite artists. We spent a lot of time in the art room together. She was an incredibly talented ceramic artist.
Sally, do you have a question?
I have a question.
Sure.
Did he have, was he married? Did he have children?
No, he had this really complex relationship with women, and you know, he was a célibataire. He was a celibate, basically, not literally, but no. And he had, and Manet. I mean, one of the first instances of them having a falling out was that Manet said Degas afraid of Louvre, and you know, and it's in a lot of the scholarship. Really, you know, I talked about all this great Degas scholarship. A lot of the really interesting scholarship of the 1970s and 80s focused on was by women scholars, people like Carol Armstrong in particular, who you know, really did a kind of penetrating study of what Degas called Degas' misogyny. Now, I'm not sure Degas. I don't really buy into that label for Degas. I mean, he spends his whole life around women. You know, that's his primary subject. And it may be, you know, I mean, it could be argued that he subjectified, you know, women, and that's where the misogyny resides. But I don't think that's really quite it. And but no, he never married, never had children. At a certain point, he writes this letter to the wife of Giuseppe de Nittis, where he says, you know, and he's probably, I don't know, probably 40 years old. God, what a mess I've made of my life. You know, I think of being alone, poor health. You know, he said he's only about 40 something. An old man. You know, I'm going blind, and you know, I probably should have gotten married. You know, but it was uncharacteristic. That's, you know, in thousands and thousands of letters, that's the only one where he got a little sentimental.
Okay, are there any more questions?
Well, it's so great to see all of you. Thank you so much for bearing with me. I mean, how many did we start with? How many did we start with, Lindley, and how many did we end up with? Don't name names, just numbers.
The biggest number we had was 69, and at this point we have 41.
Oh, not bad, not bad, you 41 who hung in there with me. Well done, you. Well done, you. I never met a Munch and Learn that I thought wasn't better being a half an hour longer.
Well, Corky says it was great, and Heather Corey says it was great, and Danielle says it was great, so interesting, and Julie says great job, and
Good.
Sylvia, thank you, and Renee says thank you, Kevin, excellent program. So good job.
Well, thank you very much. And so can I safely say that I now hold the digital record for Munch and Learn?
You do.
All right then. All right then. All right, everybody, be sure not to tune in next week. I'm sure it's great.
Yes, please tune in next week.
Great to see everybody.
Excuse me, Kevin, I have a question.
Sure.
Julie had some kind of cocktail. When was it, the other night?
It was last night.
So did you have to pay was it on Zoom?
No, it was on Zoom.
Okay, was it out there on the events on your website?
It's an event we do for our Cosmopolitan membership group.
Okay.
And so we put it out to them, but I think basically anybody can take part.
Okay, all right, thank you.
So everybody be sure to renew your memberships.
That's right, and it's a good reason to become a cosmopolitan.
Absolutely.
Oh, okay.
Thank you.
Okay. All right, everybody, thanks. Take care.
Bye.